Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. It is Thursday, the 1st of October at 1 p.m. This is the 17th iteration of the Indian Ocean Digital Series. Today's topic is the competition over technology in the geopolitical sense and how that competitive environment impacts the Indian Ocean region on everything from adapting platforms to developing new technological connectivity to general geopolitical and diplomatic trend lines. So we are joined today by Ainikki Riikonen, who is affiliated with the Center for a New American Security, which is a think tank here in Washington, D.C. Ainikki, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us. We're going to hop right in. You're our speaker today, so you get to answer this question. And I know it's a very vague question, but we're going to start with the vague and move into the specifics. And the question is this: if you were a security sector policymaker in a developing state in the Indian Ocean Rim, then what is the best basis for gauging technological competition among the larger powers? So I'll turn it over to you for your response.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you asked a really broad question, because I think when thinking about technology and competition, it's really hard to package it just in national security or economics or even in just technology itself. And we're in kind of an interesting time as the US has sort of shifted from, countering violent extremist organizations towards great power competition. And I think, while the executive branch has sort of started and lurched and is in some ways stumbling, at least in my personal opinion, to formulate a strategy, we're starting to see what might be some long-term conditions as part of this competition. And so I would also note that I think these long-term trends will continue regardless of what happens during the election here in November. And so one of those is, as the US sort of looks to decrease its reliance on technology and supply chains coming out of China, you might start to see initiatives coming out of the White House to try to, move some of those overseas. And, most of them, we can't just bring them all back to the US. And so we'll start to see, I think, some of them disperse around other parts of the world. So that might pose some interesting economic opportunities. The other thing I would note is that we're seeing an increase in terms of assessing the security of supply chains of information communications technologies through the lens of political risk. And so, the US, as it looks at China, from the very beginning, it said, well, we don't know about Huawei, but then over time has articulated a clear framework that looks at, what are the political risk components. And so we look at the basis of the legal framework there. Are companies independent? How much are they politically influenced? And so we look at Communist Party committees, national security laws, all these kinds of things, and then also where finance is coming from. And so I think that risk-based framework will build over time, and the narrative on China may fluctuate a little bit. It might increase or decrease, but nonetheless, political risk is here to stay. And so you're seeing this play out also in some initiatives the State Department has. For instance, Clean Network. It's starting to proliferate some of these ideas to other states to try to get networks to be secure. You're seeing USAID release its digital development strategy as well. And so I think, on the one hand, you saw this narrow approach that said, here are certain companies the US doesn't trust, but then more broadly, how do we assess companies more broadly? And then as a follow-on stage, how can the US act in this space to responsibly engage, basically to, help states get where they want to go in terms of their connectivity. So it's been exciting to watch, but I think the approach will get more coherent over time, which will pose, I think, lots of opportunities for lots of kinds of states.
That's helpful as a jumping off point. Two follow-ups then. From the region that we deal with primarily, and so here in the Indian Ocean Rim, the thing I hear continuously is this great power competition environment is US-China, US-China, US-China. And there's this perception that the US is pushing a narrative where the Indian Ocean littoral states and beyond have to choose between the United States and China. And it seems that the way that technology is framed with clean networks, with legal principles backing up what the actual platform or technological service is, that fits that narrative. What would you say to that? That what the U.S. position is, we're not forcing a choice. What we're trying to do is provide you the technical kind of details to protect your own information, your own data, and your own, hardware, and so on and so forth. But for someone who doesn't have a background in technology, they would say, no, you're still just forcing us to buy more expensive, less quickly provided, and more complicated Western technology when we can get it all cheaper, quicker, and so forth from China direct.
Right, I totally agree. I think the beginning framing for this has sort of been a challenge, and it'll, I don't think it's the Titanic steering into an iceberg, right? I think we've got a little bit of time to steer this particular ship back on course. And I guess I would point first to some of the fledgling dialogues between entities in the US, and especially, at least to begin with, in Europe and some in East Asia, like Japan, about what might it mean to have better multilateral cooperation to establish technology policy, whether that's working together on digital development or proliferating certain standards for 5G. And so I think the US is slowly branching out to try to bring allies and partners on board. And I think what this means is it'll break away from that, naming names in terms of countries to looking again at more broader sort of principles for risk or objectives. And I think you'll start to see this proliferate to other parts of the world as well. I do think it might take a little bit of time, because I think we were a little bit late to the party in terms of trying to figure out country neutral approaches. And the other thing I would point out too is, especially looking at the 5G discussion, there's certainly been a lot of debate whether, do you ban Huawei? Do you then pick a winner, looking at, say, Nokia or Ericsson? Or then, what is the third way forward where we're not leveraging sort of a heavy-handed industrial policy to pick winners? And so you start to see conversations about what it might mean to have open interfaces, for instance, in 5G, which is this idea that you have interoperability, you have fewer proprietary parts. So basically, if you can treat a 5G network like Legos, except instead of Lego, anyone owns the brick shape. And so, can you use this principle to basically open market competition to have other vendors that might be cheaper if you increase competition? And so I think the US, the US is kind of slowly reaching out, and it's also looking at third avenues to try to make this technology a little bit cheaper, a little bit more accessible, rather than just shouting about what we don't want.
Okay. That's helpful. I mean, the Lego thing is especially useful with, kind of, for me, not being technologically adept, to understand what you're talking about with an open system. Welcome any of my colleagues in ESA to join in with questions as well. Just raise your hand and I'll integrate you into the conversation. But let me do a follow-up. Let's switch gears a little bit. Imagine you are an embassy representative of the United States, say in Madagascar or in Kenya or in Sri Lanka. How are you going to talk about these issues? For you, someone who has experience and detailed knowledge of the actual technological language that the general public does not have access to, that you can translate from the technological realm into the policy realm, how do they approach these topics? Because the default position for somebody like me, for somebody like them, is they're going to frame it in the traditional international relations conversation that happens. What do they need to know in order to better inform the countries that they're interacting with about what the U.S. is actually trying to pursue, to avoid miscommunication?
Yeah. I think for me, hypothetically, if I were a diplomat, the way I would personally approach it would be to understand first what the demand is in the country. And so, in some places they're super hungry for 5G, even though we don't have like the user equipment to make it super useful yet. In some places it's just getting in 4G. Some places it might be looking at, mobile technology ecosystems more broadly. And so first to figure out what the demand is. And then second, I think one of the interesting things about this conversation is that it's not just about really advanced technologies, but just kind of any connectivity in general. Even, landlines have customer databases that maybe secure, not secure, and then from there to have that conversation about, here are ideas that are going around the world, not just in the US, but in Europe and other places about how to make good assessments about the technology, about the vendors, about investment mechanisms as well. I think the financial part, as you know from conversations about Belt and Road, is really important too. And then to sort of progress from there into, what can, US companies or United States policy do to support. I think there's always demand. I think there are good country neutral ways to sort of give guidance or approach it, and then from there to figure out how and where the US can plug in.
That's helpful. Policymakers. Anne, I see you have your hand up, so Anne, I'll turn over the mic to you before I move on to other questions.
Yes, thank you, Ainikki. Very nice seeing you.
You too. Great to see you.
Are we getting too really parochially focused on one element of a much broader security development issue? If you're looking at developing new relationships, if I put all of the countries in the world on a board, who are the priority countries immediately, but where are the long-term investments? And, I just got off a couple of webinars that looked at Africa and really are questioning whether we are bypassing the potential of the continent, not now and not maybe in 5 years, but in 10 years, in long term. How are we making these technology as a whole and comprehensive package and really looking at a number of issues, the supply chain issue, reliable partners, pro-democracy partners, people that really, unlike some countries, share more of the values that the US has and that the Europeans have that we might not find far out in the Asia Pacific area. But maybe standing back and taking a whole new look at who do we want our next best friend to be, okay, and where do we want to make the investments now when we have markets that are outstanding, we have resources that are outstanding, we have all these things that we just seem to be bypassing, going after the big dog in the fight, which we keep calling China or Russia at this particular point. And just would it be interesting when in your work, are they looking more holistically and comprehensively at developing a strategy? Thank you.
Yep, that's a great question because I think one of the hangups, at least in the blob that I've been noticing, is this idea that it is U.S. versus China or not, and I think, in my opinion, it should not be. And so I think we're at a unique moment in time where we have to sort of reconsolidate some of our relationships with our favorite friends. So I'm looking at Five Eyes, NATO, and Europe, because some of these are, and also Japan and South Korea. Since especially these are some of the leading technology, leading economies in the world as well. And so how can we together sort of pool resources or work on supply chains together to create a foundation to then do outreach into other parts of the world? So how do we first build that critical mass with sort of like-minded heavy hitters around the world? And then from there, really engaging, with swing states, especially larger ones. I think I've heard Indonesia mentioned. India is certainly very interesting. As you know, they have a tendency to be very independent, but sort of figuring out how and where they plug into this. I think Africa writ large is a really interesting one. China, certainly a lot of engagement on tech there. I don't know if you saw, but there's a really interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal about networks built by Huawei and ZTE and how some of their software engineers are helping do surveillance, right? And so, as the US sort of steps back, who's stepping in, what are the risks? And I think it's interesting to see too, like not just spatially, but in terms of breadth, but in terms of depth. Because if you have, one country that's adversarial to us stepping into a place, and the networks and the technology, whether that's apps, cell phones, networks are not secure, maybe then there's that ability to then do surveillance, intelligence activities and collecting information. But then you see maybe, if a country is then laying down networks to do television, maybe then they have an advantage in terms of purveying information, in terms of influencing the host country's perception, and then maybe that influences political decision-making over time. And so you start to see, like in the long term, I think the erosion of the advantage of the US and like-minded countries if, we don't kind of collectively figure out how to do something about it.
That I think is a good segue to another question I had that I think follows on with what Anne was getting at as well, and that is the kind of double-sided, the two sides of the coin in relationship to what technology provides. On the one hand, policymakers around the world are incredibly terrified of securing their information from foreign surveillance or from non-state actors hacking in and doing whatever they're going to do, whether they be for overtly nefarious purposes or they see themselves as altruistic breakers of barriers. And then on the other side of that coin is the understanding of some leaders and policymakers around the world. These technological tools are very, very helpful in having more control over their own society, whether it be the Chinese smart city idea, whether it be just the ability to understand who's doing what on what kind of platform in specific areas. It's a way to track individuals, et cetera, et cetera. What do you say about that in terms of what the United States can do to navigate those kind of discussions? Because we're obviously not going to equip an authoritarian state with all the mechanisms to further repress their own people, but nor are we completely nonchalant and about the necessity of making sure that states have some control over what's going on with technology.
Yep. I think it's tough because, if you don't mind me like stepping into domestic politics for a hot second, I think we sort of haven't figured out what this image looks like yet for ourselves. And because we haven't done that, we also then haven't figured out how we engage abroad. And so like looking at instances of US engagements abroad, you had biotech companies selling gene, how do you call it? Basically DNA collection equipment to officials in Xinjiang. And they're like, oh, I wonder what they're going to use this for. Well, turns out it's, wild oppression. And then after Tiananmen Square massacre, the US had put a ban on exporting policing equipment to China, but it hasn't been upgraded to include, say, facial recognition. It does include fingerprinting. And so, some of these existing policy tools haven't yet been modernized. In terms of what we can do, just looking at getting our own house in order first and, setting an example, I think we haven't quite figured out the way we want to manage data. There's no federal standard for data privacy. And so you certainly had a lot of people criticize this idea of surveillance capitalism. When you have an app on your phone, sure, it's not going straight to the government, but you don't know exactly where it's going or who gets to use it. And so we have this ad tech issue. But then on the other hand, looking at coronavirus, you think, what if the CDC was able to do some kind of very limited data collection to then monitor the pandemic or people's movements and do so in a way that was compartmented from, intelligence services or law enforcement or other kinds of bodies. And so, I think in the US, we haven't quite figured out a way to, A, protect people who are sort of spilling all this data from their phones, but B, we haven't figured out a way that we can use it to advance like our own governance as well. So I think it's not surprising that other countries are kind of writing their own rule books. But I think it's hard. I guess this is a running theme. I think it's hard to tell other countries what they can't do without also then giving some indicator of what is useful, what is a good way to go forward with this.
That's okay. That's a good point because that gets into the technical capacity issue that a lot of states want all of the goodies, but from a lot of perspective that I understand from tech firms here in the United States, based here, whether it be Google, Apple, Microsoft, semiconductor corporations, and so forth, even app producers, that the infrastructure in some developing states is not there. And so so when these conversations happen in a bilateral kind of government conversation where leader X is talking to leader Y, in the United States, sure, we can talk to, say, Tanzania about, sure, we can assist with modernizing some of your semiconductor facilities and so on and so forth, but if their power grid can't maintain them, then we're getting into the same problem that, say, the DoD has, where countries want 16 patrol boats to monitor their coastal region, but we know they don't have the logistical infrastructure nor the personnel effectively trained to maintain them. So in 3 years, we see these patrol boats on stilts, rusting out on shore. So how does a policymaker kind of say, listen, you're not ready for this, without sounding, very, very arrogant and superior?
I guess maybe there's an interesting question about like what can we provide and how much we need to, whoever we is, provide in order to make things work. And I guess a counterpoint I think of too, it's like it's one thing to, if someone doesn't have the capability to skip and then it's not useful, that's one thing. But then if someone doesn't have the capability and you say, well, we can give you the infrastructure and the personnel to maintain this, that sort of turns into a different other thing. And I think one interesting example, Ethiopia, ZTE built their telecoms infrastructure and then also this database called ZSmart. And they built it in a particular way such that basically anyone in security services can access text, can access phone calls, all this kind of information. So as you're building things up, I think it's kind of what capabilities are you building in, and then what personnel are you also leaving to help sort of maintain these systems. And it can be used for good or bad. I think in this case, pretty obviously bad. You have ZTE technicians helping out with a country's surveillance of its own citizens. And so, I think the way the US government issues guidance to our private companies also actually will be pretty critical as they then start to build out capabilities in other states and perhaps, continue to do systems maintenance. There's definitely like no such thing as an apolitical technological system.
That's incredibly helpful, that if they want a piece of the puzzle and you can offer the entire puzzle, that's very effective, and it does explain a lot of what China has done. Anne, see your hand up. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm going back to something you said earlier, and it was what I translate as providing bridges. You're not selling a particular type of equipment, but you're providing the technology of bridging. I always call it a system of systems approach.
Right.
So it's very tailorable to what their need is, what their technical capability is, what their budgets are, what is their capability of maintaining systems. But so you start them off, so there's this big picture in the sky, but you start them off at where are they now, and you build on that. Because I agree with Jeff. I don't think competing with Chinese, in any form, whether it's political, economic, or business, is a complete waste of effort. It's like competing with terrorism. But what you need to do is you need to be able to provide a narrative, an alternative that is more attractive than not. And I would guarantee that instead of trying to sell a system, which is often out of their reach, because they're thinking in terms of what the US has, what the Europeans have, what the Australians, the South Koreans have. That's not it. You want to make sure that what are their needs? How do you build something that is compatible with where they are in life, space, and time? And then build on that. Have it so that it can be built on as they progress, as they get budgets, but it becomes much more of a local ownership of a system, and they feel like a partner rather than a donee. Is that a word, donee?
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
It's that type of thing. That's when I talk about a comprehensive approach. That is something that you have a picture, but you're tailoring it down to make it very localized, and make it very usable for those people, so they immediately see the benefit. You immediately have a success story. They immediately want to embrace you because you have brought them something they didn't have before. But it very much is their own. It is managed and maintained by their own. And it has this spillover effect on economics, job creation, bringing leapfrogging technology in some cases for them. So anyway, I just would like to hear your opinion on that as you work these particular issues.
Yeah, I guess first thing is like I totally agree with all the things you just said. And I would also add on it, it's like an interesting time to be in the digital space, because I think when you think about leapfrogging technologies, some people went from these giant room-sized computers to then desktops to laptops and then to smartphones. And then some places just went from, analog phones and then skipped computers and then went straight to smartphones, and their entire economies, being built on this sort of handheld digital ecosystem. And so I totally agree. Like, technology is a bridge; it's an enabler. But I think we've kind of been asleep at the wheel in terms of, what is like a good way that the U.S. can engage, especially in developing countries as they start to pick this up.
Let me follow up to what Anne said with kind of a direct question related to great power competition, because even when we I don't believe that it is the all-encompassing thing by which we should be talking about engagement with this region. But the region itself constantly asks questions about, hey, what about China? Hey, what about China? Some also ask about Russia. Iran is sometimes brought into the conversation in a specific way. How would you kind of destroy the specter, if it was you, of U.S. China or U.S. Iran or the West versus Russia or whatever it is, narrative about tech? And how would you just kind of bypass that without getting into talking about platforms and legal permissions and app development and all of this kind of very technical stuff? How would you communicate that on a political way?
I think a really key element is how can the U.S. and like-minded technological leaders be responsible stakeholders, basically in the world. And because I think on the one hand, yes, there is this unfortunate specter of U.S.-China in the background, but the initial narrative has very much been in that space. But I think we're starting to see this evolution of the U.S. trying to find ways to be more competitive as someone who can provide technology solutions, be an economic partner, be a security partner. And so I think unfortunately for us, we sort of waited until a near peer competitor came up before we were like, oh dang, we need to get back on the horse, right? But I think the outcome is that the U.S. is looking to will, I think, over time look to really re-engage. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. I think it doesn't have to be about opposing China necessarily. I mean, I think secure networks are good for everyone. It means that no one's getting in, China or otherwise. So hopefully we'll see that emerge and stick. I think it kind of remains to be seen, but that's at least where I hope it goes.
That's helpful, and I think it echoes other aspects of what we're starting to realize about our engagement in this region. To make something that's overtly that's a pet project of mine related to the maritime realm is one of the challenges that has been discussed has been that coastal security in a lot of developing states is very complicated because the capabilities are not there and the capacity is not present. So you don't have enough equipment, you don't have enough personnel, and then those that you do are either given too many missions or stretched so thin that they can't effectively guard the coastal realm. One of the ideas that comes up is integrate coastal communities. Now, this is something that the established kind of maritime powers like the United States learned the hard way. It's how essentially the Caribbean corridor was shut down with drug trade, because we started working with island states in the Caribbean. We started working with coastal communities in Florida to essentially say, hey, if you see a group of speedboats hauling near the Florida Keys at 3 a.m., call that into the Coast Guard, because that's probably something nefarious. And it was a very low-tech community-driven mechanism for closing down this corridor. This has been proposed constantly in Eastern Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and in the Arabian Peninsula as a way to stamp out especially non-state actors from doing nefarious things. Technology is seen as one of the best mechanisms by which to integrate these coastal communities is in a very simplistic and not overly expensive way. How would you go about doing that? Are we talking about an app? do you jump right into the technological pool, or do you start with just building the person-to-person ties? How would technology like that, in your mind, if you're thinking about this theoretically, would factor in?
I think some of the challenge is that technology can't replace relationships. It can, sorry, there's kind of sirens outside. I don't know if you can hear it. Technology can't replace human relationships. So I would start with those human to human networks first and then figure out, like, again, we talked about what does it mean to customize to local conditions. And so, what would best suit the local population? If people love, micro websites, do you have a little one where there's a form where you can submit information or find a phone number or have an app? I think that'll vary a lot. And so I think there's not one, I don't think there's one size fits all. There's no like technological magic button. And especially I think with human networks too, it's not just being available, but I think we've learned this the hard way since 9/11, but how do you get people actually on board to want to work with you as well? And so I would definitely start there and then build technological solutions around, what can basically be the standing platform for these existing relationships.
I apologize if I'm monopolizing the conversation, but I see as parallel, having worked on border security issues, okay, with a number of countries in both North Africa and the Sahel. And what we always say is the fact that technology is not the solution. And often countries are so attracted to this idea, thinking that if you give them technology, their border security problems or their merit is solved. Okay, I worked this with Tunisians, and they think because you put in radars around the border, there is not anyone going to get into their country that they don't want in, and it's a false fallacy that they have. But I have found that from a U.S. perspective, sometimes we are our own worst enemies. Okay, if we want them to pull things together and come together, we need to make it attractive to them. We need to give them an advantage and a benefit for working together, pooling resources, pooling information, pooling human resources, and then you give them certain things. You give them either drones, small mini drones. You give them specialized training. There has to be a carrot out there that encourages them to find their own solutions to their problems, where they know more about the problem than someone from the outside does. So it gets back to, how do you get them to think in terms of smart management? Okay, not technology, but smart management. And then you just simply add the technology, again, suited to what they're capable of handling, as complementing this, and just bring them one step higher on that systems of systems approach. But it's a reward type of thing, rather than let them con you into the fact that if you give them more technology, they will not have a problem. And it's not the case. I always say, start with what you have. How can you best organize what you have? And then let a donor country or another country come in and say, this is what I can offer, because it will benefit you even more and speed up the process of your being able to control things. But you got to work together, okay? Because you can't do it on a bilateral basis. It just undermines our own objectives in the long run and doesn't help them. Just my opinion, though.
Right, I totally agree. And I think too, like, it's interesting to see the way that human judgment and networks will also like interplay with technology, even once you have it. And again, like, on the one hand, it can't replace human know-how, human networks, trust in these relationships. But then also you look at cases like, I think there are a couple of nonprofits in Southeast Asia that are using computer vision, which is an AI system that can like recognize objects, to go through satellite imagery to spot instances of what may or may not be IUU phishing, but then you still need a person who can then look at what's going on and assess within context, is it more or less likely, is the machine correct or not, and then also according to local laws, how can this be applied? And so even if you do have the high tech stuff, which might help to scale efforts, you still need people who are invested and involved in the process.
That's a great point. It also is helpful for shaming certain actors too, if you can prove who the IU phishing is attached to, which in Southeast Asia often backfires. Assuming it's going to be China, then sometimes it's another country. just as a nice little trivia fact, Belize now is one of the major IUU fishing criminal actors operating in the South China Sea. Of course, they're not actually Belizean; they're just flagged by that country. But that's just been a random thing I've seen on the criminal rolls. But as a final question to you, because I know that we have kind of exhausted you with all of this kind of onslaught of questions. And it's just this: if you were put in charge of, say, a priority for the United States when it comes to navigating through the technological competition mindset that exists between, say, the U.S. and China, or U.S. and Russia, or whatever dichotomy you want to think about, what is the trend line that you would attack first? It's Ainikki saying this is the thing that the U.S. should start prioritizing right now first before we move on to 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6.
If I could fold my sort of dream technology strategy into one word, it would be empowerment. And so as we've talked about, not just having this, how do we counter certain countries' narrative, or how do we just ban stuff and not propose an alternative, but how can we empower people here at home to best use technology to better our society? How can we work with partners and allies to have a common vision for it, establish some ground rules for what democratic values look like in the way that we use and employ technology, and then from there, really work with countries everywhere basically to figure out how can we meet demand for digital development to empower local economies, to empower connectivity in a way that's open, free, and secure. I think it's one of those things that really scales.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful and very, very succinct. So obviously you thought about that quite a bit.
A lot.
Yeah. Well, if there are no other questions, I'm gonna wrap it up there. But Ainikki, thank you so much for carving out time. I'm sure we'll be following up with you in the future. You know that you were once a part of the NESA family. You still are part of the extended family. We don't ever let anyone go. So, but again, just on behalf of me and Anne and General Wolf and everyone else, thank you for joining in. General Wolf, I'll send it to you, sir.
Yeah, hey, thank you very much. I appreciate your thoughts. And, again, the partnering concept is really pretty intriguing, right? And, the discussion you and Ann had, I found was just wonderful. So you've given us some interesting ideas. I mean, Ann and I have been listening to all sorts of other webinars. We heard the AEI webinar yesterday, kind of COVID and I think the way forward, where so many folks from the Washington, D.C. think tank world wrote about kind of what it means. And so, it's becoming quite clear to me that, it is about competing, but it's going to have to be done a bit differently. And the technology and social media side of the house and the whole 5G architecture are so critical to this competition of different systems. And the challenge is really, in my mind, is how do you, as Ann said and described, how do you articulate the differences in kind of what a free market open society offers versus kind of a Chinese command directed closed society, government run economy and nation means. And economically, we'll just have to think about it a little differently. But Ann's exactly right. You have to prioritize what's most important and where it's most important. So work on your friends and partners and those that are just outside of the mainstream. And you've helped really articulate an interesting way of thinking through that in this particular domain. So thanks a lot for your time today. Deeply appreciate it. And Jeff said it exactly right. If you are always part of NESA. Thanks for your time again today.
Thanks so much, sir, for hosting. Always nice to hear from you. And thank you to Jeff and NESA. And I hope everyone's staying well and safe.
Perfect. Well, on that, then I will stop the recording. And Ainikki, thank you again for taking out the time.